These are my three panelists with me, so maybe you guys can come up. Kim Walker from the Silver Group, yay. Jean-Michel Wu from Grace Blue, and Wendy Hogan from Oracle. And don't make too much noise because, you know, it's so deafening in here with all these people. We were joking before, we were worried about if the four of us would outnumber the audience, but we've just managed to have enough people not to do that. And in some ways it doesn't surprise me because some of us, Kim and I especially, have been talking about ageing and the ageing marketplace in Asia for a long time, and the usual response is empty rooms and very quiet voices. The challenge that I threw out to Mumbrella was, how is it that you could have a major conference on our industry in Asia and not have a discussion about the ageing population? Because it is the single biggest growth area in Asia, in every marketplace. And while we always think about Japan and as the oldest country in the world, we sometimes think about Thailand as the fastest aging country in the world over the last 10 years, let's not forget a place like India. Most people forget the fact that 9% of the Indian population is now over 64 years of age. 9% of the Indian, that's a hell of a lot, that's 130 million people. And you don't get to be over 64 in a developing country unless you come from the wealthier end of the economy, because otherwise you'd have starved to death or died of disease earlier. So the growth area for age is all about the fact that it's not only the fastest growing demographic in the region, it's also by far the fastest growing wealth area in the region. But there's a lot of unfortunate images go around when we talk about older people. So with some apologies to Graham Fink, maybe we can hopefully get this video to work.
We resented Dad when we were kids. We never had any money to do normal things. Mum had 3 jobs, God rest her soul. But at least he knows what he wants to do. Some people never have that, do they?
Look, the logo's too big.
The logo is not too big. Bloody cars. I've sacrificed a lot for advertising. I'm never married. No children.
Sometimes I think we should just split up.
My life could have been very different.
He can't even draw.
I wish we bought the umbrellas.
Oh no, well, that would have helped, but still, never mind. Yeah, come on, here we go.
I don't know
now,
if it is.
This is our big chance, so let's play this carefully and see how we go. All right?
Yeah,
wipe your feet.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure about the art direction. Yeah, the line's all right, but you need to do something to stand out a bit more. Yeah, a bit of a well-worn path, that, you know. Yeah, 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 yeah. I hate puns.
Well, I don't know, we should have...
Oh, fucking hell, just shut up, I'm fucking...
Oh, God, you're all right. You're all right, old chap.
Yeah.
Yeah, take it easy, you'll be all right. Yeah, try it.
Bloody bloke was colourblind, he couldn't see the thing, could he?
Cheers, cheers, lovely to see you, yeah. Yeah, oh,
Are they speaking?
Let's say...
Do they speak?
What? No, they don't seem interested, and I don't know why, but there you go.
So, unfortunately, when we talk about ageing and the advertising industry, that's all too often the image we also get. Now, you know, fortunately up on stage we have, you know, one guy who's 61 and looks like shit, and we have another 60-plusser who looks terrific. But we're the sort of exceptions, right? Because how many people over 60 are even talking at this conference? How many over 60-year-olds have you guys actually thought of employing? I don't mean as replacements for yourself, but I mean at all levels of the workforce, in your agencies, in your companies. How many clients do you have that are actively going out and seeking people that are 60, 70 years of age to work, to target, to help target, understand, market to, advertise to, communicate with the single fastest growing demographic in the region? So what we wanted to do was to run a brief panel about ageing. So often when I'm doing workshops, and Kim and I both in our different ways do a lot of workshops with organisations to try to get them to understand the ageing societies. I do a little exercise. If you imagine if you all sat around and you closed your eyes and I say, now I want you to picture somebody, a silver, a typical senior, etc., etc. What I usually find out is that people usually start thinking about people meaning at the end of the life period. If you say silver or seniors, oh, you mean like retirees, like da-da-da. Did you know, when I first started doing ageing studies in 1988 in Australia, that in sociological textbooks around the world, retirement was referred to as waiting for death. Now, these days, the average retiree, in most of you, in your retirement, would be expecting to live another 30 years. So you're not exactly waiting for death. In fact, there's a lot of argument you're in the prime of life. You're not talking about your grandmother, because when we start talking about seniors, we automatically picture in our own head our grandmother. Well, my grandmother died 45 years ago, so she's not exactly typical of what a 60 or 70-year-old would be today. And they usually have something wrong with them. You know, they're a bit doddery and they're a bit blind and deaf, and don't joke, Tori, because I am a little bit deaf, but that's different. The trouble is we think of images like this. But reality is, when you're thinking about somebody who's 60, you've got to think about somebody like this, right? Because that's what they are. The most highly technical generation that mankind's ever seen is the 60 to 70-year-olds today. No generation has seen as much technological transformation as that generation has, including all of those younger than the 67-year-olds today. Every statistic you will see will talk about the fact that, particularly in Asia, ageing is the single biggest growth area. It's often talked about as the biggest problem for the region and its governments, but it's also the biggest opportunity for any business, any organisation. It's where the money is. Unfortunately, you think of headlines like this because you tend to limit your thinking about ageing populations to things like the waiting for death qualifications, the type of categories we associate with waiting for death, like nursing homes. But in actual fact, this is more typical of what's going on. It's the leisure time. It's changing life. It's growing again. It's becoming what we call new life builders. Just because your grandmother doesn't particularly play a lot of mobile games on her phone doesn't mean there aren't millions of grandmothers who do. Take, for example, this lady who became quite famous last year because at 82, she had created what became, at one stage, the #1 selling new game on the Apple Store in Japan. She taught herself to program at 80 years of age, and 2 years later was developing top-selling games. Everybody that does market research in the region will be publishing tons of reports, this is from Mintel, but there are tons of others, that will explain endlessly again and again and again. 28% of Chinese consumers aged 55 to 74 say they would like to spend more time travelling. That the boom industry for the travel market is the 65 pluses. It's where all the money is. But that's true for so many categories. Kim will talk more about that in a minute. The problem is this. The problem is, are we as an industry geared to understand and actually target and talk to people that are 60 plus? And that was encapsulated for me by this gentleman here, Toru Shibata. Toru at the time was the president of J&J Japan. He now runs the single largest pharmacy chain in Japan. A few years ago, we were sitting in a meeting all day planning for J&J how we were going to do some projects to target 65-plus-year-old Japanese with existing J&J products, just by changing the way they were talked about. We spent all day planning in that session. There was about 7 members of my team from McCann when I worked there, 7 members of his J&J brand teams. At the end of the day, we had 6 plans, 6 products that we were going to focus on. We were going to change the marketing, etc., etc. And Toru, who happens to be exactly 3 weeks younger than me, turned to me at the end of the day and he said, "This is fantastic, great plans. The only problem is this." And then he looked at the 2 rows of teams. And he said, "The problem is this. Dave, your team, I'm guessing, of your account management team is average age 34. My team of brand managers is average age 35. And none of these guys, and it's a sexist world, they all were men, none of these guys on Friday night, when they're having drinks with their buddies, wants to be able to say, 'Well, what are you working on?' 'Oh, I'm working on how to change Listerine into a product for 75-year-olds. Nobody wants to do that. And his solution was, why aren't we hiring more 75-year-olds to come into our brand teams? Not as CEOs, not as chief executives. Why aren't we hiring more 60 and 70-year-olds into the mainstream of our businesses? People who want to be re-educated, people who want to retry, people who want to go back into the workforce and do something new and different. And there are millions of them out there. It's not a bad thought. The world is learning that actually people of that generation and those older generations are all about trying new things. When the Japanese baby boomers first started to retire in 2007, the single fastest growing product in terms of sales in Japan of any product and service was electric guitars. It was literally hundreds of thousands of 60, 65-year-old Japanese men giving up work, going back to join the bands they'd given up in university 40 years before. There was a huge boom industry in not only electric guitars, but also in garage band movements. But the garage bands were all made up of 65-year-olds. They became #1 best-selling music acts. The karaoke companies of Japan decided that there's a way to make money out of that, because during the daytime, who was going to the karaoke places? They started to get these retirees to bring their garage bands and practice inside the karaoke fixtures. This all goes to the fact that there's a lot of myths about marketing. They don't buy new stuff. In fact, if you look at all the statistics, you'd find that people in their 60s and 70s are more likely to experiment with new stuff than their children are in their 20s. They don't try new brands, products, and services. There's some work done in the last few years has shown that millennials actually don't like trying new brands and services compared to people in their 60s and 70s. 60s and 70-year-olds are people, especially in Asia, who have spent the last 40 years having to experiment because their societies have changed so fast, they've had to learn to adapt, change, adapt, change, adapt, change. And they still are very good at adapting and changing. They are not switching from good fun to survive. They're actually switching from good fun to, now I've got more time, so what am I else going to do? And they can't use technology? Well, that's patently not true. Now, we could go through all the answers to those things, but categories, guitars, all these things, all real life indicates to us that these are actual myths. None are true. They're not technology strugglers, they're actually the real technology natives. If you think about somebody in Asia who has grown up in, say, Singapore and is now 65 years of age, they were the first generation of Asians to ever have to use a television, a Walkman, a remote control, a microwave, banking machines, PCs, home PCs, video recorders, video cameras, mobile phones, and yes, quite often also iPhones, smartphones. Because if you think back when smart iPhones and smartphones first started to arrive on the marketplace, who could afford them? Middle-aged business people who are now in their 60s and 70s. They're the ultimate adoption generation, the ultimate technology natives, and so on. So what we find is, as a generation, they're actually about trying things. Retirement now has got shifted to retirement. It's about trying new forms of exercise. We were just talking in the break. Kim's taken up a whole bunch of new types of exercise. This guy does nothing else but exercise, but that's cool. They try to make a difference. Charity work, learning new hobbies. They try to fill their passport with travel. They're trying new technology all the time. And interestingly, they're looking to try new jobs. If you think about the fastest growing area in education in Asia over the last 10 years, it's been people in their 60s and 70s going back, looking at re-educating in different areas. Partly as a way to fill in time, partly to try and do something different and new. Of course, we saw the movie, but not the reality. Show of hands, please. Who employs interns in their organisation? How many interns have you ever accepted that were over 60 years of age? 0. Now, actually, in some countries in Asia, that's illegal. Hong Kong is just shifting its laws. Up until now, you could not employ somebody as an intern if they were over 35 years of age, which is a very ageist sort of idea, right? So these things will change. We have to realise that for the first 15 to 20 years after people theoretically hit their 60s, they are what we call new life builders. They're actually exploring life, looking for new things to do. Just like this gentleman who became famous in England about a year ago. You might have read about this. This guy actually brought ads in newspapers begging somebody to hire him. He's a 79-year-old who wanted a job, any job, just to give me something to do. He became famous. The BBC covered a lot about him, working as a cafe waiter. It's all what's referred to as the big return. Now, the reason why you want to return to work might be because of fragile incomes, unstable markets, the threat of the loss of what you're going to do in terms of retirement funds, generational dependency. You have kids who need money. Still happens a lot, too much. Longevity, the fact that you've now realised you are going to be around for 30 more years. I've got to do something. I might as well go back to work, part-time, full-time, anytime. And more importantly, it's engagement, finding interesting things to do. So the challenge maybe for us as an industry is how do we start to absorb some of these people to help us understand how we're going to market better to people just like them. So we wanted to focus on some of these questions that really are ageist. Why don't we focus where growth is as an industry? Why is the industry so focused on the group of people that don't have money, millennials, or post-85 generations, or whatever you might want to call them in different countries, and not on the generations that really have the money? Does a generation stop being an efficient target? Or thinking generation, does that stop us? Why don't we see more use of older workers at all levels of organisations? And what's the potential for more a diverse attitude in business, marketing, with employees as we think about the ageing population? So we're going to open up to a discussion. Kim's got a couple of very interesting charts. He's going to just take us through to show you some numbers, I hope.
Thank you. Congratulations, everyone. I think you should be given the Innovators of the Conference Award for actually turning up. You know, you deserve some sort of... Normally when I talk about ageing, I usually tell the people at the back to lock the fucking door so that people don't run out. It's not the sexiest subject, I have to admit. But, you know, Dave's talked about some of the myths and some of the, you know, the misconceptions. I want to talk about, you know, when I'm discussing with clients what products they might want to sell in this area. You know, like the sort of the mental image that you came up with a senior. Normally people think, oh, for that sort of consumer, we're probably talking about adult diapers, hearing aids, some sort of spectacles, maybe retirement homes. Yeah? They sound fairly intuitive, right? I'm here to tell you that's absolute bullshit. I believe in this age marketing matrix. When you think of products and services that are specifically designed for and marketed to an older consumer, I call those age silo. They are the assistive devices, the things for people in the later stage of life. Very important, not trying to deny the importance of that at all, but that's just one very, very small slice of the pie. So the age silo pieces of marketing are very important, but the trend worldwide is moving towards age neutral, where products and services that are designed and built for anyone to use are marketed to anyone to use. Like Dave said before, I'm a very keen sports person, and I'm pretty sure that when Garmin, the maker of GPS devices, last designed their running triathlon watch, they didn't think that a 63-year-old consumer would be standing on stage wearing one. They didn't design it with me in mind. And yet, I've got the money and I've got the time to enjoy that sport. That's age neutral. Apple, iPhone. Apple as a brand generally is age neutral. You know that 50% of all Macs worldwide are sold to people over the age of 55. 50%. 60 plus, people aged 60 and above have the highest check count on the Apple store. Because Apple is an age-neutral brand, and they do it quite deliberately. But they don't ram it down people's throats because people don't want to sell products to old people, and old people don't want to buy products designed for old people. They want to design products, they want to use products that make them feel engaged with life. And this is the trick how to do that. 80% of luxury cars are sold to people over the age of 50. 50% face care and cosmetics over the age of 50. Now, think about that in the context of the advertising imagery that we all create. 49% of consumer packaged goods sold to people over the age of 50. In the United States alone, we're talking about $230 billion US in sales per year. 51% of OTC medicines. No big surprise, right? But how much do you think the industry is engaging with that consumer? And how well, how effectively? I think the answer is pretty poorly. 80% of luxury travel is bought by people over the age of 50, and a lot of it is bought online. So how do you do this? How do you sell something to people who don't want to be patronized and don't want to be stereotyped as older people? And I can't help but saying this is all in the book that I wrote, but I will say it's all in the book that I wrote. And we've coined this 25 effects of aging, because attitudinally, we don't change. You know, I came to Asia first in 1977. Yes, I'm that fucking old. I came here at a very, very young age with a backpack on my back and a one-way ticket into Bali, and I trekked overland for 12 months. Went right up through Myanmar back in the days when it was called Burma, into Bangladesh, Nepal, India, Sri Lanka. I was an adventurer. And in 6 months' time, I'm going back to Nepal. I'm still an adventurer. Attitudes and behaviours don't change that much. Life stages change the way we consume, but not age. I have 70-year-old friends who were lined up at the Apple store here a few days ago to get the Apple 10. We don't change. But what does change is the inevitability that our physiology declines. It begins, unfortunately, with the eyesight, touch of grey hair, wrinkled skin, all of these things. But if you add them all up, there are about 25 of them. And if you understand what they are, just understand the sorts of implications they will have, and then you overlay those implications on a customer journey, starting with communications, of course, online experience, the retail environment, the product itself, and the support that surrounds the whole thing. If you can overlay all of those effects of aging onto your customer experience or your workplace, you will end up with an environment that is good for everybody. There are no barriers. So before I hand back to Dave, I just want to ask a few questions about observations that I have of the ad industry and why we're failing as a business. And I want to just ask you to think for a moment, do you remember your first childhood kiss? Do you remember the moment? Do you remember the girl or the boy that it was that you had that kiss with? Do you remember the moment? Because I can. I can remember. And do you remember the moment that you got married? The day? How did it feel? How did it transform you on that day? Do you remember the smells and the colours? Do you remember the birth of your first child, assuming you have children? We don't lose those feelings. They stick with us. And that's what makes advertising people so special, because we can empathise. When you talk to a 30 or 40-year-old copywriter or art director and you say, write me an ad for Nike shoes, they can do it because they can project back into history and they can feel what it was like. So now let me ask you, how does it feel on the day that you lose your job and your career is finished? How did you feel on the day that you realized that you had a critical illness? You don't know. This is in the future. It will happen, but you don't know. And this is what aging is all about, right? Because we've been there. I've been through this. I know what it's like to be 1 minute at the top of a company running a region, and the next day the phone goes quiet. And not really knowing where your next dollar is going to come from. I know what that feels like. Now, then the ability of a young advertising person to be able to project, to empathize, becomes impossible. How can you possibly empathize with something that you don't have a personal experience with? And what happens in Asia usually is you turn to the next best thing. You turn to your parents. I'll use my parents as the model, because often you live in the same house, or your grandparents. Oh, I know what older people are like. I know what they think. I know what they do because I live with my mum and dad, or I see them all the time, so on and so on. And I'm afraid that fails because, you know, what we used to say years ago was never ever talk down to a teenager when you're communicating. Never talk down to a teenager. And the same applies in reverse. Never talk up to a senior, because when we're being advertised to, we want to be talked to at our level as a consumer. We don't want to be talked up to. So I think this is a real danger that we have. And one reason for this is if I asked you to say, I do this in workshops as well, I say, look, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you think your parents know who you really are? How well do you think they know that you really, all of the good stuff, but the bad stuff as well? And the answer usually ranges between 3 and 6. Yeah? How well do they really know the person that you are? Even that's your parents. Now I'll put it the other way around. How well do you think you know your parents? Do you really know them as a consumer? And the answer is no, you don't. There's no way you'd know them as a consumer. So as advertising people, younger people trying to communicate to older people, it's very, very difficult and very easy to get wrong. That's it for me. Thank you.
One of the barriers that I guess Kim and I have particularly talked about, but anybody that looks at ageing studies understands that one of the barriers that quite often people in our industry have is, well, it's what I call the laziness theory. Well, they don't know how to use, you know, mobile technologies properly, so we can't employ them and we can't use them. But is that the right attitude? So we were talking about that with Wendy, about attitudes to technology, and maybe you just want to explain to people what you were telling us.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels in the conversation you just had around thinking about, it's not just about age, right? Like, people are trying to adapt to a different kind of customer journey, a different level of customer expectations, and that's right through an organisation, and people have to change the business model to adapt to constant disruption. And that means you really need to be thinking about employing and retraining and reskilling within your organisation to think customer in, and to change processes and KPIs and the type of technologies you're using to understand your customer. And you can use different data signals, and you can use offline and online technologies to merge together to connect and engage with a customer at any age, if you're using the right kind of tool sets to do that. And so then it's about what creative you're engaging them with and what content you're engaging them with. But there's so many more opportunities to do business differently, and I think people are struggling to get their heads around that. And it's more about mindset than it is about age. And I think if people are adaptable and agile and curious, that's what values and skills that people should be looking for, as opposed to judging people by their age and their experience levels.
Right. So, you know, Jean-Michel is HR expert, and we've been talking about this, well, theoretically anyway, but we've been talking about this for, you know, the last few weeks as we got ready for this, and we've both commented on the fact that, as always happens, we're talking about this today, so in the last couple of days we've both seen a lot of exchanges on LinkedIn about pathetic cases of some guy getting into trouble because he hired somebody who was over 50 and his boss got mad at him for hiring a 50-year-old. What are the sort of barriers that you sort of see going on?
Well, I think there's a general assumption more than anything else. This industry is seen as being quite young. And the people that are tasked with doing the recruitment of staff feel that if a resume comes in from a senior person, then they'll assume that there's experience, but there's also a high cost to it as well. And as you know, there are not that many senior level roles left. So it's an assumption, and it's an assumption that carries on through. I think that perception should be changing, especially where there's a target market as large as this that's not being fully exploited. And in some degree, I mean, listening to how you were talking about this now, I was just thinking, why hasn't a group started to focus on senior marketing, age-specific marketing? And why can't that be staffed with senior people, you know, to do that role, to do those roles? There must be a reason behind it. There must be something that we're not getting.
Right.
If this market is so big as you say it is, why haven't the boffins at the larger groups thought this is a great opportunity? So, you know, that's a question back to you. But I think in terms of how that might change in terms of the recruitment of senior people in coming back into the market, retrained in the market, is there are different economies, the gig economy, for example, where you can go in as an interim, or you can go in on a freelance contract. I mean, we've done that before with quite a few senior people, and that, you know, I feel more comfortable as a exec search consultant bringing in somebody with so much wisdom, so much experience to actually help an agency or a client in times when they really are in need, than if I was to get, you know, a 30-year-old to run that kind of business. So I think that might change. I think in some economies in Australia, in Asia, Australia is a good example where they do have a lot of more freelance and interim recruitment going on for senior experienced staff. Here, not so much, but I'm kind of hoping that will start to change.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the discussions that we had in different connections with, as governments face the issues of pension funds not being big enough, how to take care of a dramatically aging population, what happens in a country like Thailand, which 18 months ago became the second place in Asia after Japan, where the population starts to shrink. The mean age of Thailand this year will reach 52, which is sort of shocking to people. You know, there's a lot of older people in Thailand who have a lot of time, are now looking to get back into things, and so we're seeing a massive rise in re-education, etc. But when I asked a couple of local recruiters, not necessarily in our business, but just generally recruitment companies in Thailand, not long ago, about how many people do they place in middle management positions that are over 60 years of age, the answer was 0. And the answer was, well, we never thought about that. We never even thought about considering people at that age and putting them back in the middle positions. As I mentioned to you earlier, Toru, the guy from Exchange-A president in Japan, in his new role running the biggest pharmacy drugstore chains in Japan, has now instituted a policy where every one of his major teams has to re-employ somebody over 65 to come in at a middle management job to be part of the team, to help organise things, to help them get an older person's point of view. And some of these people have been senior executives but have come back down into much lower level payment positions in order to be able to just do something interesting and offer their, I guess, experience, their wisdom, and be involved still. So what technologically do you think are the barriers? Wendy, do you think that it's not the technology itself, it's just the attitude, right?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the mindset, right? And I think similarly where we see, I think it's like the digital and the non-digital divide, it's very similar, right? Like if you get it and you're comfortable with technology and you're adaptable, it doesn't really matter what age you are, but I think the recruiters, as much as the agency people, you know, they don't know what they don't know. And so the same as this diversity debate, right, around unconscious bias against women and against other, you know, ageism is another form of that lack of diversity in a conversation around how can your brand be successful or how can your business be successful. So it probably needs to come into that education of different generations around what the opportunity is, because I learnt a lot just from the preparation we did for this around how big the opportunity here is in the region. But I think a lot of people are hiding, you know, a lot of people who don't get what they could be doing, you know, they're hiding behind a rock hoping that it'll all just go away and that, you know, they'll get to retirement age and not have to get their heads around how to do business differently, how to use digital and operate in a digital world.
Right.
And those people probably, you know, it's harder to reskill them and retrain them. But people with a growth mindset, they're just grabbing opportunity anywhere and everywhere, right? Like you guys, you've built completely new businesses around this gap in the business world right now.
Well, trying.
Yeah, but it, you know, obviously it's an opportunity, and it's something that if you grab and drive it, you can make a business out of it.
I think Jean-Michel's point before is the million-dollar question. If the opportunity is so big, why aren't there more agencies or groups that are focused on it? And you know, you and I are, and we know it's a tough haul.
Tough
and I
sell.
think the reason is it's just not cool. You know, it's just
It's
not
not shiny,
cool.
is it?
Huh?
It's just not shiny.
It's not shiny. And, you know, if you look, the average age of marketing advertising people in the UK and in Australia is 33. Well, it's very, very hard to get a 33-year-old person excited about selling to 60 plus, you know.
And that's evident by the number of people in the room, right? Like, they haven't come along to this session because they don't think it's relevant
I
to
think
them.
it's telling by, I wouldn't want to guess, no offense guys, but let's figure out, have a look around, what's the mean age of the people in the room, and I guarantee it's a lot older than the mean age of the people generally at the conference, right?
Yeah.
You're a biased sample. And one of the things that's interesting, because we called the session Ageism, because when I first contacted Wendy about being on the panel, you just said, well, it'd be an interesting alternative to the normal thing about talking about, you know, the
Being a
women's
woman.
thing and diversity.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an interesting thing for me that, it, you know, and I'll admit this. When we first put forward this session, so Mumbrella's first said to me, but you've got to have a woman on the panel. You can't have a panel that doesn't have women. Okay, that's all right. My throwback to them was, but you're going to have every one of your panels, for everything else, there's got to be at least one person over 65, right? What are you talking about? You know? And so we do live in a very ageist business and in a world that is peculiarly old and getting much older. And my final point will always be, the number one barrier I always hear is, oh yeah, but I need to hire more young people to build for the future. This is usually coming from executives that I'm talking to that are planning to retire within 5 years. So their idea of the future is the next 5 years, and they're not really thinking of the future, because the future of every one of whichever market you live in, demographically, the future is older people. That's where the growth is going to be. And so shouldn't you be gearing up to prepare your company to cope with that better?
I think, you know, you've got a quote, the United Nations. Population aging is unprecedented. It's a process without parallel in the history of humanity. Population aging is unprecedented. It's a process without parallel in the history of humanity. Now, if you take those words, this is from the United Nations, no less. It explains, I think, partly why the world at large is having a tough time coming to grips with this. We have never lived in a world that is so topsy-turvy in terms of age. And we are all pupils of this paradigm that was created post-Second World War, when people like Rossa Reeves and Theodore Levitt came out with their principles of marketing, and they looked at the world around them. They saw this huge spike in babies being born as a result of the Second World War, and they thought, wow, think of all the baby products we can sell. Boy, let's focus on these guys. And then as they grew older, they invented the term teenager to accommodate these people, and they started marketing to the teenagers. And then they got a bit older and they became young family people, and they started marketing houses and stuff to them, and so on and so on. But somehow, around about the age of 30, marketers didn't change anymore, and they kept on saying, well, we've got to refresh the brand. We've got to recruit new, younger users, was the expression I heard all the time. Meanwhile, that pig in the python is sliding through the python and is now 50, 60 years of age. But the marketing world is still saying, got to recruit new users, got to bring in the younger people. These are the people who are cash-starved, workaholics, have no time to spend the money, and focused on trying to build their nest egg. Meanwhile, older folks, you know, are living, you know, the life that we worked hard to achieve, and no one wants to talk to us. It's ridiculous. So over 50% of the high net worth individuals in Asia Pacific are over the age of 55.
So for the sake of the fact that we've run out of time, and I apologise because we could talk about this all day, but what I would encourage you, please, as you attend more conferences, as you read Mumbrella or any other publications in the industry, encourage the editors, the organisers, etc. Where is the section on the biggest growth market in the region? At every conference, in every publication. And why isn't there more focus on that?
And then ask us to come and speak.
Thanks very much.